Hard to believe that we're already into the second parak of Zevachim, standing or seated. The din of Yoshev in Zevachim Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, where we look at the fact that when somebody is standing, he's a different human being than that same person when he's sitting. It's not just an activity. It defines a state of being and consciousness that is different one from the other. The Gemara is looking for various sources to the din that a zar is posel la'avodah, that a person who's not a kohen can't do any of the practices of the korbanot, with the exception of the shchita, the first one. All the others from Kabbalah on, from receiving the blood into the utensil and the rest of the avodot of the korban, he's not allowed to do. Where do we get it from? The Gemara has been going through various ways of learning this out. On our daf, the Gemara wants to learn it out. Rav Meshashaya Omar, Atye Kalvachomer mi Yoshev. This din of the zar can be learned as a kalvachomer from the law of somebody who is seated. Ma Yoshev she'ochel. A Yoshev, a seated person, is allowed to eat the korban. That's a discussion all of its own. But he's allowed to eat the korban. He can eat the korban in a state of sitting. Im ovad chilel. But if he served one of the services of the korban in a sitting state, he's mechal, then he passes the korban, he makes the korban, he disqualifies it. Zar she'eino ochel, a zar is not even allowed to eat. A person who's allowed to, who eats the korban in a sitting position, let's say a kohen who's allowed to eat parts of the korban, and he does so in a seated position, that's okay. But if he serves in a seated position, it's not. A zar, somebody who's not a kohen, is not even allowed to eat the korban. Eino din she'im ovad chil, so certainly if he does the surface, he's mechalel. Then the Gemara says, Ma'al Yoshev shekin posel la'edus. How can you compare it? A Yoshev is a very severe thing. A Yoshev, a person who's sitting down, can't even give evidence. As we see in the posuk at the top, V'amdu shnei hanashim asher lahem ariv lifnei Hashem. The two people who have the argument should stand before Hashem, lifnei haKohanim v'ashoftim asher yu b'yamim hahem, in front of the Kohanim or judges of that time. Says Rashi, based on Chazal, on the Sifran, on the Gemara, V'amdu shnei hanashim be'edim ha'katuv medaber. The Torah is talking about witnesses. We learn from here that women can't serve as witnesses. And we learn from there that you've got to give the evidence standing up. And I'm struggling with this piece of Gemara because it's so different. The din of a Yoshev and the din of a zar. A zar is an immutable, inherited, physiological, biological fact. You're not a Kohen. You're not descended from Aaron HaKohen. You don't have the Kohen gene. There's nothing you can do about that. A Yoshev is a person who's sitting instead of standing, is doing something wrong. It's an action. It's not a qualification, and that's why I come to this idea. The Gemara seems to be considering the fact that a Yoshev is a different person from an Omed. That Chaim Yankel, when he's standing, is not the same Chaim Yankel as when he's sitting. That there's a different awareness, there's a different consciousness, there's a different state of being. Otherwise, why does the Gemara even make this kind of comparison? And it seemed to me that that's what Tosfos is dealing with. When Tosfos says, on this din of Ma'al Yoshev shekein posel la'edus, that a Yoshev is not allowed to give evidence, tzarich lizaher shelo ladun al pi edut miyushav. Tosfos says a strange thing. So you've got to be very careful not to judge according to the edut, according to the evidence of a witness who was sitting when he gave the evidence. And then Tosfos goes on to say maybe even b'di evidence. We'll see in a moment. The wording of Tosfos is difficult. Tzarich lizaher. Therefore, you've got to be careful. Where do we see such wording? Tosfos doesn't say you've got to be careful not to break Shabbos. You've got to be careful not to talk Lashon Hara. It's also, you just know, it's an Issa D'Oraisa. That's what it is. Why this word of Tzarich lizaher? So somebody came into my study this morning. Very, very interesting. You know, I don't like quoting anybody that I don't know. And I didn't know him. I'd never seen him before. And he sits down with this beautiful smile on his face, and he's just sitting smiling. And I can't place him. I don't know who he is. And I ask, he doesn't answer. Doesn't tell me who he is. He won't say a word. He says from here, he's the Meleches Yom Tov. He's the Meleches Yom Tov, Rabbi David Lapin. And I'll tell you about him in a moment. And he says, Kavanatam What you're struggling with in the Tosfos's words is demehacha muchach lahade ba'inan amida be'edim havi min haTorah v'lo asmachta ba'alma. You're right in learning the Gemara the way you're learning it, that sitting down is an inherent flaw in the person. It's not just he's doing something wrong and you can easily correct it. It's a flaw in the person. You see from here that these words, tzarich lizaher, what Tosfos is telling you is, don't think this is just an asmachta. Don't think that yes, maybe it's midoraisa, maybe it's from the Torah, but it's just that the din is you should stand. It's a courteous thing to do for an aid to stand. And we've got nasmachta v'amdu shnei anashim asher lahem ariv. We can learn it from there as well. No, says Tosfos, tzorich lizoyer, this is a doraisa, because the human being is a different human being if he's standing or he's sitting. It's not the same aid. So I do a lot of research to find out who this beautiful man is. And I discover he's from the time of the Vilna Gaon. Not only is he from the time of the Vilna Gaon, but the Vilna Gaon was at his engagement party, I discovered. That he got engaged to the daughter of the Vilna Gaon's mechutin. Rabbi Avrom, the Vilna Gaon's son, married the daughter of this same person, and the Vilna Gaon was at the engagement party. How do we know that the Vilna Gaon was at the engagement party? Because the Meleches Yom Tov's grandson writes that at that party a strange thing happened, and it's become quite a famous story, but this is the source of it. There was said that some wine was being passed around, and the Vilna Gaon refused the wine. When they asked him, why are you refusing the wine? He said, because you can't drink wine that was stored under a bed overnight. But who knows? How do you know that it was so? They checked up and it was true. The wine was kept on one of the beds overnight. And to see from there the sensitivity of the Vilna Gaon, but just to see also that halacha makes a change, a physical change in an object that can be sensed by somebody who's on the level. It's an unbelievable story. And there are many such stories with the Vilna Gaon, but that happened at the engagement party of the Meleches Yom Tov. And that he was a person who, the Meleches Yom Tov, all these people, we hardly know them. It's brought, the Meleches Yom Tov is brought in the Otzar and Beforshim at the back of the Gemara. It's just brought as a little note. And we know so little about these people. He used to sleep 4 hours a night in half-hour stretches. 3 hours at night, 1 hour during the daytime. That's how he used to sleep. He was the Rov of a little town called Kapulia. And he was offered the Rabbonis of Vilna for multiple times the salary of what he was earning in Kapulia. And he thought about it very carefully, and they tried to persuade him to take the position, and he turned it down because it was a big town, Vilna, and he wouldn't have enough time to learn. And he figured that would disturb him. He was a young man at the time. He was in his 30s, and he decided it would distract his learning. And he went back to the town. He said, I'm not asking you to meet the salary of Vilna. I know you can't do that. I'm not taking the position in any case. You don't have to barter with me. I'm not taking the position. But if you could pay me just a little bit more so that I can come out at the end and I can live not in such poverty, that would be amazing. And of course they did. That's the Meleches Yom Tov. And he says this word, tzarich lizaher, is an important chidush in Tosfos. Tosfos is telling us that there's an inherent psul in an aid who's standing. It's not just you should stand. There's an inherent psul in the aid who stand. At that point, Rabbi David Soloveitchik comes in and he says, I don't get it. If this is a doraisa, if this is so serious, I still don't understand the words of tzorich lizaher. Just say pasul, that it's a psul in edus. We know that you're not allowed to. You want to say it's doraisa, say that it's doraisa or oraisa. Ma shayach b'zeh lishna di lizaher, ha'ashtas v'rele l'tosvus du dina doraisa ha'ma'akev be'edutam, v'im hi'idu b'miyushav havi edut psula. If they gave evidence sitting down, it's disqualified edus. It can't be accepted. V'asur ladun al piyat osu. What do you mean tzorich lizoyer? You should be careful not to. So he almost learns differently from the Meleches Yom Tov. The Meleches Yom Tov says tzorich lizoyer. You've got to be careful because this is so serious. This is an inherent psul. And Rabbi David Soloveitchik says tzorich lizoyer seems like lighter. You should be careful not to. It's not that you should be careful not to. It's pasul. It's a pasul edus. So then I was put in a very difficult position because the Meleches Yom Tov, with his smile, this beautiful smile on his face, just said to me, explain it. It's a good point that Rabbi David makes. Explain it. How do you learn it? How do you understand it? So I understand it that tzorich lizoyer is an amazing thing. Imagine If somebody comes in front of Beis Din and gives evidence, and he's a brother of the accused, it's very easy to put that evidence aside and say, I can't accept that evidence. You're a brother, you're connected, you're a Nogea Bedova. There are all sorts of psulim. It's very easy for me to put that aside. But imagine the Chofetz Chaim comes to give Eidus. And he's sitting when he gives Eidus, leaving aside the din that the Gemara comes to the Talmud Chacham is allowed to sit, leaving that aside for a moment. The Chofetz Chaim tells a story, and he's sitting. How easy it is for the Beis Din to ignore that story as if it was never told. Why? Because he was sitting. It's not a psul in ne'emonis. It's not because there's something with a ne'emanut. When a person is a karov or is a nogea bedavar, when a person has a connection with a case, one can understand whether the reason for the psul is because he has an interest or it's another reason. But the Dayan understands very clearly, I can't accept this evidence. But a tzaddik can come and give evidence. All that's wrong is he's sitting instead of standing. Tzarich lizaher, you've got to be careful not even to consider that in your judgment. It's got to be completely out of your mind, no matter who it was, just because he was sitting. That's the tzarich lizaher, zehirus. You need zehirus. You've got to be very careful. This is not an easy din for a dayan to be mekayim, is the way that I would answer Rabbi David Soloveitchik's he'ora. And what is the difference? The difference is, it says in Vayera, when the Malachim came to Avram, it says, V'hu omeid aleihem. He stood by them to serve. The server stands, the guest sits. When you're in service, you stand. When you're being served, you sit. And it's a completely different persona. If the server, you go to a restaurant and there's a particular person who serves you, he's the server. You come to the restaurant one night and he's there with his wife sitting at the table, enjoying a meal, and somebody else is serving him. You relate to him completely different. What's the difference? He's not in service. He's being served. We are different when we're being served than when we are served. I've mentioned sometimes to some of you, when I was young and I was working for a company, the policy was everybody traveled economy class. Nobody traveled first class, even the CEO. And I had to have a very, very important meeting with the CEO of a very large public company in London, and I was the person they chose to send. And the CEO met me on the day I was leaving and said, I hope you're going first class. And I said, no, I'm going economy class like you do. He said, no, you're a young guy and you're going to meet a CEO in London. You've got to feel like a king when you arrive there. You feel different when you're served. You act differently when you're served to when you are in service. An aide has to know he's in service, he's not being served. He's not, oh, I'm an aide, I'm coming to Beis Din. No. You're there in service, and you're there in service of the Din Torah, you're there in service of the people involved in the case, you're there in service of the Dayonim, you're there in service. You stand at attention, you don't sit down. Because the way you speak when you're seated is different from the way you speak when you're standing. In the old days, you used to have in classrooms, a child wanted to ask a question. What did the teacher say? Stand up when you speak. You remember that? Did anybody have that in those days? Or am I that old that I'm not? You've had that?
Put on your blazer.
Put on your blazer and stand up if you want to address me. Put on your jacket and stand up if you want to address me. Why? It's different. You think differently when you've got your jacket and you're standing up. And you act differently. When you're sitting down for Kriya Shema, that's one kind of being. You're listening to the Rebbeinu Shalom talking to you. When you're in Amidah, you're standing up pleading with the Rebbeinu Shalom, you don't sit down. Then you stand up. You're a different person when you're standing. And the whole idea of taking the 3 steps back and the 3 steps forward, like a malach, you take on a different persona when you're in a state of Amidah. And so we see here that the Gemara at this point of the discussion, and Tosfos at this point of the discussion, considers a person in yeshiva as a physiologically different being, just like the difference between a Zar and a Kohen, a Yoshev and an Omed, a seated person and a standing person, are 2 different persona. Tosfos goes on to say it maybe, and he brings proofs, maybe even those Doraisa b'di'evid, it's okay. B'di'evid, if the person gave evidence sitting, maybe they can still accept the evidence. And I believe what Tosfos is struggling with backwards and forwards, and he doesn't resolve it, he just suggests it as a shema, is that very issue. Is this a din that an aid must stand? Is this an action that the Torah requires of a witness? Thou shalt stand. And what if you didn't stand? Okay, so you didn't do the right thing, but the aedus is still aedus. That's the second view of Tosfos. The first view of Tosfos is no, you weren't a qualified aid when you were seated. No matter who you are and what your qualifications are, you weren't a qualified aid because you were Yeshuv. That's where Tosfos is holding in the first statement, and that's why the Meleches Yom Tov says that tzorich lizoyer is a major chidush. The chidush is not just that it's a doraisa. That's not such a chidush. The chidush is that b'di'evet, at this point in Tosfos' reasoning, even b'di'evet, even if it's done, and now by mistake the Dayanim accepted the judgment, can you act on that judgment? Even b'di'evet, you cannot do so, because what was wrong was not just that the action was not correctly fulfilled, the person giving the evidence, even if it was the Chofetz Chaim himself, as I say, leaving aside the din of a Talmid Chacham, being seated instead of standing is a person who's posel eidus, who can't give eidus. He's as disqualified from eidus as a zar is disqualified from bringing a korban.